Recently, a former MI6 security chief said that Putin seemed likely to be planning to launch cyber attacks on the West when the time was right. A few weeks ago, the United States government's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency launched an advisory that warned that hostile actors had gained the capacity to hit industrial control systems. But what does that even mean? Is there really anything that a technologically advanced society would have to fear from such attacks? Now, some people presume the answer to that must be no. The truth isn't so straightforward. Let's have a look. In this video, we are going to delve into the world of cybersecurity and hacking, and to try to do so in a way that makes sense for people who don't speak binary. And it's important. The fact that many people don't get the technology and therefore decide to just phase it out, to ignore it, that turns out to be the hacker's best friend. So let's start for now. In 2014, John Hultquist from the small private intelligence firm Eyesight Partners was sent a piece of code from its Ukraine office saying that they thought they might have discovered what's called a zero-day vulnerability. A zero-day is a vulnerability in some software that would enable a hacker to gain access or do something they're not meant to do, and nobody else yet knows about that vulnerability. Which is what any hacker is going to want. A way that they can compromise a system that nobody's picked up, so no one's producing defences against it or patching the vulnerability. In this case, it turned out to be something very new in several senses. The code was exploiting a vulnerability in Microsoft Office, so software used by vast millions of people across the world. It was contained in a PowerPoint file and could extract itself and gain full control of the computer, which is a pretty major problem. How did it gain control? Because the code it extracted was a variant of a notorious piece of malware. Malware is a computer program designed to do harm called BlackEnergy. Now, BlackEnergy was well known. It was a hacker tool online, but this variant was considerably more sophisticated. The PowerPoint it was attached to was a list of pro-Russian terrorists written in Ukrainian. Now that seemed unlikely bait for normal opportunistic hackers. It suggested more of an espionage purpose aimed at the Ukrainian government. When Hultquist tested the code on a safe machine, at some point it tried to connect over the internet to an address somewhere in Europe. That was the command and control computer. Once the malware had emerged, it was phoning home for instructions on what to do next. It turned out that when he checked, that server was still up, and it contained files written in Russian. The BlackEnergy malware also contained a kind of campaign tag, so the hackers could track which version had penetrated where, and it was the word Arrakis. Now, any science fiction nerd will know Arrakis comes from Frank Herbert's novel Dune, where rebel freemen ride monstrous sandworms to rebel against the Empire. As future versions of the same code were discovered, they all had different code words that also came from the Dune novel. Because of that signature, the researchers codenamed this particular hacking group Sandworm. They scanned online virus databases to see if any other variants of this had been reported, and they found another sample from 4 months earlier, this time hidden in a Word document, a discussion of oil and gas prices that seemed like bait for a Polish energy company. And then you started to wonder, why would espionage hackers be targeting a Polish energy company? Not only that, but while the PowerPoint zero-day attack was new, the more they looked, the more they found a broader attack campaign from this group that stretched back for years. The Dune referencing code dated back to 2009. In other words, they'd been quietly penetrating organisations in secret, unnoticed, for half a decade. Again, why? The news about this Dune-themed Russian hacking campaign made the Washington Post, Wired, large numbers of tech and security industry trade journals. But it turned out it was just the tip of the iceberg, and the real story hadn't even begun to emerge yet. Pretty soon we got the first glimpses. So Kyle Wilhoit for the Japanese security firm Trend Micro saw the reports, set out to review any code samples that they'd gathered to see if they had any matches, and they found one. But here was a first highly important and unusual feature, because the malware that he found was associated with a file named config.back. Wilhoit had a background in industry before he'd gone into cybersecurity. He realised that this was a .cim file designed to be used by a software program called Simplicity, spelt with a C. That software is not business desktop software. It is part of an industrial control system sold by General Electric, which is used to control industrial machinery. The sort of systems that are not supposed to connect to the internet at all because they are too sensitive to be exposed to potential hackers. This was enough to make it clear that Sandworm, this unknown group, was not focused purely on espionage. Spies don't need to know about industrial control systems. It seemed like they were gearing up to do something with a more immediate and substantial real-world consequence: to hijack physical machinery. 13 days after Trend Micro released their report, the US Department of Homeland Security released its own report, noting that Sandworm had built tools for hacking other industrial software sold by Siemens and Advantech Broadwind. There was evidence that the hackers had successfully penetrated numerous critical infrastructure targets over the course of recent years. The report didn't spell it out, but iSight's analysts checked with their contacts at the DHS, and it was confirmed that some of those targets were in the United States of America. So Sandworm were poised to act. What exactly were they poised to actually do? Well, we found out soon enough. In October 2015, Ukraine's largest TV company, Starlight Media, had two of its servers suddenly go offline. Which, initially, nobody thought it was a big deal. The servers were restored from backups and restarted. But Alexei Yasinski, the company's director of information security, was suspicious because the chance of two servers going down at the exact same time, that seemed incredibly unlikely. He quickly discovered that the two machines had been key ones, domain controllers that had privileges over hundreds of other machines on the same network. And they bore distinctive signs of having been hit deliberately by hackers. But the company had gotten lucky. Those computers had destroyed themselves prematurely because they had been set to destroy 200 other computers at the same time, but that had failed. When Yasinski analysed a copy of the program that was in the backups that each computer made on a daily basis, he was struck at how advanced it was. It had multiple levels of obfuscation, which meant it was able to avoid antivirus scans. The tool that did the damage was a piece of malware called Kill Disk. The clue, I guess, is in the name. That had been around for some time, but the sophisticated wrapper around it was certainly new. It turned out that it was yet another form of BlackEnergy, the malware that was a key tool for Sandworm, but with new modules suited to its specific task. Other companies had also been targets all at the same time, and some had not been so lucky. TRK, another media company, had lost more than 100 computers in the attack. Ukraine's biggest railway company was hit, as was Kyiv's main airport. That represented a major step in the growing sophistication of these sorts of attacks, but it was still focused on bringing down desktop computers. Soon it was going to move to even bigger real-world impacts, beginning just a couple of months later with taking down a power grid in western Ukraine. That takes us into new territory, targeting infrastructure. But let's be clear, crossing that particular line was not done first by Russian hackers. Let's step back in time quickly to see where this came from, because it's going to establish a key theme by the time we get to the end. Back in 2007, there was a demonstration in Idaho that flagged the potential for the future. The US government had a massive electrical generator set up in an 890 square mile piece of land where Idaho National Laboratory had an experimental power grid set up. The demonstration was to see what damage could be done by saboteurs or adversaries to American infrastructure. Security expert Mike Assant had fed into what was code-named Aurora. Assant was focused in particular on what is called the protective relay. This is a safety mechanism. If lines overheat or a generator goes out of sync, the protective relay detects it, opens a circuit breaker, and that should isolate the trouble and protect the rest of the system. Assant had decided to test out an attack targeting those relays. At 11:33 a.m, they kicked it off. The attack constituted injecting 30 lines of code into the protective relay, and it did just one thing, that code, to flip the device's logic to the opposite of what it should be. So at 11:33 a.m. plus 23 seconds, the relay noted that the generator was perfectly synced to the grid at 60 Hz. Normally, that meant all was good and it would just leave the machine alone. But now, that observation meant that it did the exact opposite. It opened a circuit breaker to disconnect it. Once it was detached, the generator instantly began to accelerate, since it was no longer sharing its energy with the rest of the grid. And as soon as the relay saw that it had sped up to be completely out of sync, its reverse logic meant that it then chose to reconnect it back into the grid. The watching audience, made up of government and industry officials, saw the generator shaking with massively violent forces. Chunks began to fly out of a panel as the black rubber grommet that linked parts of the generator shaft were being torn apart. A few seconds later, the relay repeated the sabotage cycle, disconnecting and then reconnecting the machine, and by now, smoke was beginning to emerge. Within just another minute or two, the generator was completely destroyed. The engine shaft was found afterwards to have collided with the engine's internal wall. Wiring and insulation had melted. Overall, it was a brutal and violent end. This was the first proof of concept. Hackers who attacked a utility could damage key components beyond repair with just a few lines of code. The other key development, there had been a growth from the early stages of foreign state agencies beginning to use hacking for espionage. Russia was particularly active, a fact which was admitted at one point by a Russian general during the Yeltsin era, only for that general to be removed rather rapidly from office, possibly indeed from his freedom, maybe even his life. They particularly crossed lines in the cyber attack that was carried out against Estonia in 2007, and the cyber attacks that supported the physical invasion of Georgia by Russia in 2008. But those attacks were relatively unsophisticated, flooding services with large amounts of random data, what's called denial of service attacks. The fact is, it wasn't Russia who pushed it up a gear. In 2007, around the time when those experiments were happening, wrecking a generator in Idaho, Iran was working on enriching uranium to enable it to develop nuclear weapons. And it was getting quite advanced. Israeli intelligence was estimating that Iran could have a viable nuclear bomb within 6 months to 2 years. The options seemed to the US to be either 1, letting Iran obtain nuclear weapons, which seemed highly likely that such weapons might be used, or 2, launch a strike on the development site, which is an act of war. So they were keen to find a third option. Key to the nuclear enrichment process was a series of sophisticated centrifuges with cylinders that were over 6 feet tall. This led to the Stuxnet program, developed under President George W. Bush and handed over to incoming President Obama. In 2008, Iran's engineers began to have problems. At random times, one of their centrifuges would spin out of control until it ripped apart. There was no warning for this happening, no obvious cause that they could see, but it kept happening. The costly mystery led to internal disputes, people got fired, they just couldn't work it out. Well, eventually the mystery was revealed. An antivirus firm in Minsk, Belarus, found a computer from one of its customers in Iran that had been stuck in a loop of restarts and crashes. When they investigated, they found something much more sophisticated than anything they'd seen before. A piece of malware had embedded itself in the computer's operating system, and it had infected the computer with a powerful zero-day exploit that infected any USB stick that was inserted into the computer. This was how it spread. Any other computer that had such a USB inserted would quietly, with no clicks required, no indication to the user whatsoever, it would take over the machine. The company Symantec found that the malware had spread to 38,000 computers around the world, the majority of which were in Iran. And they noted that it was focused on Siemens Step 7 software, which was used on industrial control systems. Indeed, Stuxnet, it seems, had one single goal: to check for the presence on any network it entered, specifically for nuclear enrichment centrifuges. The mechanism for spreading via USB made sense in that context. Iran's engineers had, for obvious reasons, made sure not to have the development site's network connected to the internet. So the malware instead spread to large numbers of computers via USB sticks. Surely at some point, some engineer would end up putting one of those sticks into a computer on the nuclear development network. And at that point, it would silently spread through the network, find the computers running the Step 7 software, and then lie in wait before letting rip. Once it was worked out what Stuxnet did, wasn't an act of genius to figure out that the United States and Israel were likely to be behind it. Figuring that they might as well go out with a bang, the Americans and the Israelis released one more final series of Stuxnet versions that was more aggressive. And before Iran's engineers had gotten to grips with the problem, it destroyed nearly 1,000 more of their centrifuges. Now, you can celebrate that as a timely intervention to prevent an aggressive and unstable regime from getting nuclear weapons. Plenty of people did. But at the same time, the American state crossed an important line. A critical cyber strike against the infrastructure of another country. If you could do that, and insist that it did not, unlike a missile strike, constitute an act of war, well, that's an important signal, sent and received by your enemies as well. And not only that, but America's elite state hackers had discovered important zero-day vulnerabilities, 4 of them in total in Stuxnet's code. Just reflect, rather than reporting them to Microsoft so they could be patched to keep their users safe, they kept them to themselves so they could use them to hack foreign nations. Whether the move was justified or not, and you may have your own views on that, it was a first step in the creation of a new geopolitical norm. Former NSA and CIA Director Michael Hayden told the New York Times at the time, "This has a whiff of August 1945. Someone just used a new weapon, and this weapon will not be put back in the box." And so it was that when Russian hackers first carried out a blackout attack on the Ukraine power grid, they crossed a line, but it was, in one sense, the same line as the creators of Stuxnet. In just one regard it was different, an important regard. While Stuxnet had a military target, here they crossed also the line from a military to a civilian target. They infiltrated the systems with an email carrying an infected Microsoft Word document. They then used the BlackEnergy malware to hijack the controls and open the utility's circuit breakers. Strangely, at that point, the official American position was that what happened in Ukraine wasn't that much of interest to the United States, in spite of the fact that the BlackEnergy malware had been found in US utilities. Its position was that the Ukraine attacks simply couldn't have happened in those US utilities because they were so much better run. A statement which didn't seem to have a lot of evidence or validity. And this was a key moment. All that investigating into just how devastating an attack on infrastructure could be. Now, exactly such an attack had been made, and the US government dismissed it as relatively unimportant. Security researcher Robert M. Lee said this: "We talk and talk and talk about this red line for years, and then when someone crosses it, we say nothing." Now, various things happened in the coming years that kept the focus on hacking for espionage and influence rather than sabotage, not least the Russian hack of the Democrats and the release of the Hillary Clinton emails during the 2016 election. But Sandworm returned in late 2016 with another wave of attacks against targets in Ukraine. And what's more, security researcher Anton Cherepanov recognised that the malware this time was structured to be able to deploy any one of 4 different payloads, each one which was designed to send signals to a different industrial control system. It was duly named Indestroyer. Not only that, but the code was highly modular. It could be swapped out easily for other protocols, including those used in the United States, for instance. This was something you hadn't seen before. Most hacker malware is simple, highly targeted. This was becoming more sophisticated and flexible. And one thing is clear, you do not build that sort of complex, powerful piece of software just to use it once, to create a 1-hour blackout in Ukraine. All of this was building up to the big one, and the hackers got a present to help them from an unlikely direction. In late 2016, a Twitter account called Shadow Brokers claimed to have hacked the NSA and stolen some of its most classified files. Specifically, they hadn't just hacked the NSA, they had hacked the NSA's elite hackers, the ones who created Stuxnet. After a bunch of toing and froing, eventually they just put it all online in April 2017, and it was spectacular. What they'd uncovered was a set of immensely powerful hacking tools, the sophisticated state hacking arsenal of the United States. Boom! Online. It included more than 20 distinct tools. It introduced the zero-day Windows vulnerability Eternal Blue, which could walk unimpeded onto any Windows system running anything older than Windows 8. And once there, you could plant a backdoor to get future access back into the system via a program called Double Pulsar. These tools were seized upon by hackers everywhere, as you might expect. Double Pulsar responded to a certain type of network message with a distinctive call sign. A while after the leak, researchers sent the pings of that call sign out to the entire internet and got tens of thousands of responses, each of them from a computer that had been hacked by the NSA's code. Before long, this turned into a nasty piece of malware, WannaCry, which invaded, amongst other places, the UK's National Health Service with ransomware, locking up its computers and demanding payments in Bitcoin to recover them. It was quickly found that WannaCry was using Eternal Blue. And of course, Sandworm added it to their arsenal as well, just in time for their biggest hit by far, which came in the spring of 2017. That started when they hacked into the servers of a Ukrainian software company, Linkos Group, which produced a accountancy package, MEDoc. They infected the MEDoc software updating process, so that all the users of the package ended up with backdoors in their systems, ready to receive whatever payload Sandworm chose to push out to them. Now, that's pretty devastating, right? We are all used to software that regularly, quietly updates itself, usually patching bugs and vulnerabilities. Well, not in this case. The official updates were the things that were infecting your computer. And then, when they were ready, Sandworm flipped the switch. So the bank ISSP in Ukraine was one of the first to realise it was under attack. Within an hour, 90% of its computers were permanently locked. The malware, which became labelled as NotPetya for geeky reasons too boring to go into, was extremely virulent. Craig Williams, a researcher at Cisco, said, "To date, it was simply the fastest propagating piece of malware we have ever seen. By the second you saw it, your data centre was already gone." Ukraine was hit hard. The government's health ministry, watching the news of target after target falling, decided to act before they were next, and they unplugged the ministry's entire network. Every computer, desperate to protect the mass of data, including catalogues of medicines, the national database of organ donors and recipients, let alone the staff payroll. Some other federal government agencies followed suit. For ones that didn't, well, they got shut down by NotPetya. Either way, the entire government was pushed offline. It hit Ukraine's railways, its airports, the post office followed, which as well as the post shut down money transfers and pension payments. Contactless credit cards stopped working, a majority of cash machine ATMs stopped working, grocery store checkout systems were down. Within hours, it had also spread beyond Ukraine and hit numerous international companies, starting with those that had a site, of course, somewhere in Ukraine. So pharmaceutical giant Merck, which reported it lost 15,000 Windows computers in just 90 seconds. FedEx in Europe, TNT Express, Cadbury, Mondelez, Reckitt Benckiser. This hit them all, caused hundreds of millions in damages. Then there was Maersk, the huge shipping company responsible for large amounts of the goods moving around the world. On June 27, 2017, their computers began to go black in a virtual cascade. Within minutes, trucks turning up at the New Jersey terminal with their cargo found that they could not get access. The volume of cargo that suddenly couldn't get to port was huge. Some of it was perishable produce that would rot. Some of it was otherwise time-sensitive for just-in-time supply chains in Europe. It was the biggest crisis ever to hit a major shipping company. There seemed to be no easy way out. A team had to trace through the entire network trying to work out what they could do to recreate the complex system that had just been completely dismantled. The big problem was the company's domain controllers, which were all destroyed, and without them, they could not rebuild the network. They did a desperate search across the company, and they found just one domain controller in Ghana, which had been temporarily offline when the attack happened because of an unrelated local power cut. They flew that one machine pretty quickly to the UK. It was the only reason they were able to recover at all. A pretty close call. In total, across the various Western companies that were hit, it was estimated that more than $10 billion worth of damages were sustained. Analysis of the NotPetya code showed once again a direct link back to the Sandworm group. By 2018, Sandworm had been connected to the GRU, the Russian military, and it all fitted to the country's particular view of how you fight a war against your adversaries. So in 2013, an article based on a speech by the Chief of Staff of the Russian military, General Valery Gerasimov, said this: "In the 21st century, we have seen a tendency toward blurring the lines between the states of war and peace. Wars are no longer declared, and having begun, proceed according to an unfamiliar template." And it talked about how the new form of war could be fought and won. It included the following: reduction of the military economic potential of the state by the destruction of critically important facilities of its military and civilian infrastructure in a short time. The NotPetya attack finally got the US government to respond. The Trump administration produced sanctions. And on the same day as those sanctions were announced, the FBI and DHS confirmed that Russian hackers had, starting in 2016, targeted a wide range of American critical infrastructure targets, including water and energy utilities, and not leaving out the nuclear power plants. In some cases, they said the hackers had penetrated deep and reached industrial control systems. Now, they hadn't pulled the trigger, but they had gained enough access that they could have been in a position to do that, had that been their plan. Secretary of Homeland Security Christian Nielsen said that it seemed to have been a reconnaissance operation, an attempt to prep the battlefield. Some people have proposed that our civilian infrastructure should be off limits to this sort of state-sponsored action, that there should be a sort of digital Geneva Convention where all the nations agree not to do such things. And some have even called for Russia to be tried for cyber war crimes for the actions of Sandworm in the current conflict, the war in Ukraine. But the reality is, such a convention would not get agreed, and not least because America wouldn't want it. As cybersecurity analyst Joshua Corman said, Countries like the United States still think they benefit more from their own ability to wage cyber war than they would gain from depriving their enemies of that power. America thinks it has the best hackers, so it doesn't want hacking to become akin to an act of war. Think about that for a moment. By the way, a lot of the quotes and details I've covered here came from an excellent book on all of this called Sandworm by Andy Greenberg. Very much recommended if you want to get into the detail. And if you're concerned about the societal impact of technology, you might be interested in another video I made recently about the huge implications of artificial intelligence on this difficult geopolitical moment we're in. If you've made it this far, you might want to watch that one next.